Hello and a very warm welcome to all of you on this evening of book discussion around um, this recent, very fresh publication from um, our friend Nitin Sinha. The book is called Against the Fetishization of Plural Time. My name is Pankaj Jha, and I'm going to sort of be there as a discussant and timekeeper and um, regulate the time on this discussion on a book on time. So I'm a is a historian. He did his PhD from SOAS, School of Oriental and African Studies in 2007 in London University. Before that, he did his master's from JNU here. And since then, he has been working as either a researcher scholar or a teacher of history in a university. He's currently working in the Center for the Study of Modern Orient, popularly known as ZMO Berlin, Leibniz ZMO Berlin. As a research scholar, he also co-leads there a team, a research unit called State and Society, right? And he has finished one ERC starter grant on the history of domestic servants in 2009 that resulted in two edited volumes on domestic servants. Apart from a series of papers, research papers published in various international journals. And currently, he's almost at the fag end of another ERC research is ERC funded research grant called which is basically on this project of history of time. It is called Timely Histories, a Social History of Time in South Asia. So uh, Nitin has also has a large number of publications to his credit in some of the best journals all over the world, and he has his first book was on communication and infrastructure. His second one, this one monograph, that is his second monograph. This one is called Against the Fetishization of Plural Time. So I now invite Nitin to talk about this book, about the ideas and arguments, and as they say, inspirations and questions that led to the making of this book. Talk about the journey of writing the book and the journey since then, as also perhaps throw open few ideas here for discussions. He'll probably speak for anything between 30 to 40 minutes, and then we can have discussions um, around the book on what he says and have a good time, basically. That's the idea. So over to Nitin.
Uh, Thank you. I would like to begin by thanking Professor Corinne Lefebvre, who was I would, who invited me and who created this opportunity for me to come and talk about my book. Unfortunately, she's not here, as we know, because of some personal reasons. Um, Thanks to Pankaj, uh, partner in Crime and Time. We did. He was when I was doing the domestic servant project. Pankaj was our early modern interlocutor, so to say. And since then, we have been associating um, uh, on various projects. Also glad that Prabhu is here, who has been always a very a sounding board, if I may say, for pitching very raw ideas to him and testing the ground. Um, I'll I'll I will have 3 or 4 segments in which I would talk about this book, but I would like to begin by talking about the project per se. And I'm very happy to see students here. I'm assuming you guys are pursuing your MPhil PhDs or are in early career stage. So I think that might be of interest to briefly speak about the journey of this book through my own research, how I reached here, as well as what we have done in the project, which has been running for this is the 6th and the last year of the project. And then I'll come to the key arguments which are there in the book. Won't be able, I'm finding it increasingly difficult. Now, in hindsight, I think writing this book was a bit easier than presenting it. So, yeah. Um, Although it was not easy to write that book also. So the book's journey actually began. So in our group, we were 5 or 6 members, doctoral and postdoctoral, and based in Berlin, and we would have fortnightly meetings. And maybe after 2 years into the project, we decided that how about we each write a page on what we have learned so far through common readings and discussions, source material discussion, as well as key text, key historical works. And I wrote on something that I'm at that time I remember that how useful is this framework of plural time and pluritemporality. It was a kind of a very raw-ish uh, uh, series of rambling thoughts on 2 pages. And from there, it started taking some shape, of course, through a lot of interaction within the group and with people outside the group. And then it started growing and taking some shape, which eventually took almost 2 years to come into this book form. Um, where the key argument of the book is actually there in the title of the book itself. The book uh, it 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 has a critical. It does not dismiss the framework of plurality. It talks about its usefulness in understanding society, um, and society through transformations. But it has a critical engagement with that framework, and I'll come to that part later. So one of the things, so I look at I look at the modern period, so to say. In my own research, I focus a lot on the first 100 years of the colonial rule from 1750s to 1850s, but of course also interested in the later period, and I have worked on that later period, and I have worked so far on a variety of themes, for good or for bad, I don't know. But I have worked on history of transport and communication. Then I looked at a bit of agrarian history. I looked at riverine landscape and Tiara, what is known as in the state of UP and Bihar, and Chor in Bengal. So I was looking at fluvial landscape and law. Then, of course, I was also working. I worked on railway labor and railway township, so I was a bit familiar with labor historiography. Then I worked on domestic servants, which opened a new world of the relationship between law and labor in the late 18th century, and also importantly, the space of domesticity. And so that's the long trajectory of how I came to actually take up the question of time. Because I was encountering, like, I had some preliminary ideas while I was so, particularly, like, in transport history, the question of speed and acceleration becomes very important. The coming of the modern time is often traced through the coming of telegraph, railways, and other networks of infrastructure. Uh, so that was one aspect where I wanted to go. That what does it mean to think of the making of the modern time in the context of Indian history? Then second was obviously I was because of my interest in agroecological as well as labor history, I was thinking of the relationship between law and labor and what kind of legal temporalities one can think of. That emerged actually, that idea was sparked in 2014 or 15. I had presented in a conference in Kent called Law and Time. And I had presented on boatmen. At that time, I was working on boatmen. And there I was seeing that the work of boatmen was broadly structured through two streams. One was the increasing use of master servant regulations. So one was the stream of law, making them accountable for their work, for finishing work on time. And the second was their work site, which was the river. So with winds, working with against the wind, with the wind, torrents, storms, and so on. So so ecology was creating one set of temporality, and law was creating another set of temporality. So how ecology and law were coming together, and that was my preliminary idea. So if somebody asked me what was the genesis of this project, I would say actually more than more than being interested in history of transport, actually that was the genesis, that how do we think of, and I was thinking through the framework of multi-temporalities. So how do multiple temporalities come together to structure the world of work in a very narrow manner, in a focused manner. From there, the project the idea of this thing kept on growing to the extent that when I wrote this project in 2019, it had become a big umbrella project with 5 different modular units. Um, a lot of the, I mean, we all know E.P. Thompson's classic work on uh, work time and capitalism, and many other sort of, dealing with particularly on the theme of labor and time. If we look at the existing literature, we'll find that the primary site of focus for research is always the factory. The making of the modern time is traced on, is more easily would be the wrong word, but more readily perhaps traced on the sites which we already, or the histories of modernity have already ascribed with the value of the modern. So these are the sites: army, school, factory, and so on. So state institutions and modern and networks of communication, particularly railways and telegraph. So once when one takes up this query of how to do, or to trace the history of the making of modern time, we usually go to those spaces where we feel that we will encounter that process a little bit more easily. So, for instance, army, school, barracks, factory, and then emerged in the broadly in the literature, existing on literature on time. Home is a very relatively less worked upon area. How does what is the social history of home when seen from the lens of time and temporality? So this project was trying to try to identify what are the othered spaces, the spaces which have been othered by the process of the making of modern time. So instead of factory, we decided to look at agrarian farms and fields. What is happening there? Instead of we prioritize the site of home to have this inquiry of the making of the modern time. We we were deeply committed. We still are deeply committed to situate and contextualize the making of the modern time from in a long process as emerging from the early modern period. Um, so the I am interested in the history of night. So I was trying to reverse the order, like, rather than working on day, let's see what is happening in the zone of night. Rather than working on factories, modern factory, about which there are, of course, a lot of source materials. Not that there are not source materials on agrarian fields and farm, but let's go to the uh, other side of the work and see what is the history of the making of the modern time. So this project was trying to inverse certain spaces and then to inquire the question of the making of the modern time. Um, and the a very important component, as and I would stress that, was to not see it as a rupturous moment emerging, I don't know, from 1860s or 1820s or 1757, but to have a long view um, of how the processes mutate, culminate into something else over a period of time. Um, so that is what that is what the larger remit of the project is, and we individually have been working on that and published also. Now, some most of the publications are in the pipeline, but if you are interested, you can look at the Journal of South Asia History and Culture, where a special issue had come out just recently in January. So the other aspect was, and of course, I mean, we always try to raise questions when we spot some historiographical gaps. I mean, we are constantly in dialogue with what the existing work is and what new we can find, or what new we see in our source materials. So that dialogue always goes on. Um, my understanding of the existing work, at least in Indian history writing, on the issue of time has been, of course, I mean, we all aware of the now the classic work of Romila Thapar, taking up the question of cyclical and linear time. Um, but broadly, if I can summarize with some level of generalization and some level of violent generalization, um, would be that a, a, the predominantly the focus has remained on understanding the nature of time, the intellectual the intellectual iterations within the religious culture. So there are, like, what time is in what is time in Hinduism, or what is the meaning of time in Buddhist literature, and so on. That kind of work is there. um, then then there is a lot of emphasis on using time to talk about prevalence of historical consciousness, and using time to understand the politics of periodization. Um, and these are very rich studies which exist there. They are extremely helpful in actually framing the where I wanted to go to. I wanted to take a leap from there into turning this question uh, into a query of social history. And uh, for me, it is a. I wanted. I think I have approached the issue of time, um, turning it into a historical question of what happens when time becomes an element of social relationship, and finds itself embedded in uneven equations of power, and how does it become a resource of command, an element of dispute between and amongst people. I'm interested in the question of what people did with and in time rather than what time is. I approach these questions of with and it through empirical investigations of people and their practices. So that's where the social history part is coming into the play. Uh, So, by foregrounding people and their practices to the forefront of our research, I wish to push the idea that a social history of time can be imagined in terms of investigating what people do with and in time. People interact with time to turn it into a resource of to exercise power, or to turn it into a resource of power. People do things with time and thus create possibilities of multiple forms of engagement with time. They slot it, document it, catalog it, and conquer it. In contrast, people act in time because time retains its given character, which exerts its own authority in how social groups attain and resist that power. People do things with time, and in the course of doing so, give meaning to it. But people are also constrained by the universality of time, such as bodily degradation or planetary movements causing day and night, which they may socially explain in a varied manner, but may not control reverse, or collapse it in any absolute sense. Therefore, they are forced to act in time, which is independent of human action, while they simultaneously interact with time to make it their own. Practices shape meanings of time, but they also happen within the matrix of time, which is not often mutable. Multiple forms of engagement with time do not make time itself multiple or plural. I propose to locate the stuff of social history as resolutely purged between this constant traffic of practices with and in time. And that's where, so I'm the key argument of this book, which I think is that I see time as a given entity in which we act, in which human societies act. So it is something which exists outside of the human society. But simultaneously, it is not the preceding order of what comes first and what comes later, but simultaneously, we also try to make it our own. And hence, there's absolute there's no dispute over the fact that there is a is multiple and plural forms of engagement with time, but I resist the idea that multiplicity of engagement make the entity itself plural. I am not making that journey, which a lot of other scholars, sometimes conceptually and sometimes also semantically, I would say, they make that key, they make that jump. I am not doing that. I resist myself to stay with plurality once when we talk of multiple forms of engagement. But for me, that multiplicity has to be understood, and I use different kinds of phrases actually, and perhaps it shows some kind of not indeterminacy, but some kind of anxiety to explain my point. So I use like time as a universal fabric, time as a universal placeholder. So I'm trying to get across this idea that this constant duality of being interacting with time and being situated in time is where the histories of where the is located actually. um, I uh, I uh, I do not want to some a few words on social history. I do feel broadly we have witnessed a bit of decline of social history in the last 2 decades, and I feel that there is a need to reinvent it, reinvent it in more innovative way. So one section where and so for instance, some of you, I'm sure you guys followed the current debates, say, on the Anthropocene and deep time and interspecies relationship. I think that's one area where social history needs to take into account how to address the question of justice by taking interspecies relationships also into factor. Uh, but as also globally we see growing inequality, for instance, the framework of class needs to come back into our analysis more prominently than it is done. uh, and the growing social unevenness and economic unevenness through whatever, through global trends of migration, uh, climate change, injustices of various types. So those things are making are, to me, they are indicators that uh, uh, we must polish off the dust on our toolkits of social history and give it a fresh lease of life. That's where my commitment as a historian is. I'm not saying that this is right or wrong. I'm saying that I'm currently thinking in that manner of how to sharpen our tools of understanding through the lens of social history. Because for me, and I'll go back to what Sumit Sarkar in one of his talks in 2007 in Goldsmith College in London, he had said, and in his opening remarks, that social history somehow tries to, at least it is the closest to help us understand the totality of things, because it prioritizes two things: interconnections between different aspects of life, social, economic, political, and contradictions. Interconnections and contradictions have to be paid equal attention to. They have to come together into our mode of analysis. And then we can see how we expand further the remit and the scope of social history as we encounter new challenges ranging from global forms of authoritarianism to planetary time crisis. So that's where on the but methodologically, why one or two of my friends had suggested. So there are three chapters in the book. First two chapters are critical engagement with historiography and different frameworks in which time has been studied, also in the disciplines of sociology and anthropology, and not just history. And but the third chapter is where and that is my favorite chapter, because there I become a historian, where I pick up themes to demonstrate what I am arguing for. Um, I I go back to some of my own researches, but also go back to some of the wonderful works done by colleagues and friends. I reread their work um, in order to demonstrate that what I mean by social history of time. So the third chapter is actually the demonstration of some of the conceptual ideas which are there in the book. Um, so one of the key questions which I try to understand in the book is what do we mean by social time, and are we doing a history of social time, or are we doing a social history of time? And I give some space to discuss this in some detail. I mean, the way I have understood how this historiography has moved, scholarship has moved, social time in the early 20th century, mostly coming from the through ethnography and sociology and then anthropology, was that it's neither individual, it's not purely psychological individual time, nor it is a completely abstract time. It is getting formed through rhythmic and repetitive actions of collectives. Social time is neither individual nor completely abstract, but it has a sense of abstraction. It has this entity or value of abstraction because it is based on society's repetitive modes of doing certain things. Um, uh, in the realm of rituals, in the realm of religion, in the realm of economic practices, taking your cattle out in a particular month, and so there is a kind of a repetitive abstraction is emerging through the repetition of the rhythms per se. um, so that is, and so once we understand social time through certain repetitive value of certain practices, it is bound to be plural. I mean, there is no dispute on this idea that social time is not plural. It is plural. But for me, so one of the things which I was struggling when I was doing these readings is this a point of end, as in, you end your query at the doorstep, that time or engagements of people with time is of plural variety, or should it be the point of departure to say something else? Um, that led me to inverse that question, that rather than adding to the adding through new empirical stuff to show that yes, social time is plural, how would it look if we say that we are not doing a history of social time, but we are doing a social history of time? And that required me, I think, to place time as a universal placeholder, fabric, measuring unit, but which is irreversible. I don't think I commit myself to saying that time is linear in a progressive manner, that it will lead to more, like humankind's progression. I'm not. We understand the problems of uh, that kind of, modernization, which has roots into Eurocentric views. I'm not using the word linear in that sense, which is ascribed with certain values, but I'm using the word linear just to simply state that time for me is irreversible, hence it is universal, which then allows us to write the histories of differentiation better. For me, the crux of historical uh, of history, of understanding the past, and this movement from how we have reached here and from where, and how it is based on this idea of mapping what I was earlier saying, the varieties of interconnections, but laden with contradictions. And contradictions are the places where possibly one of the places where one can see the institutionalization of certain types of differentiations which have happened in the past. So for me, um, uh, this uh, variety of interconnections, hierarchical, graded, how they mutate, how they create new structures of differentiations. They all we will only be able to understand when we have a when we measure it against something which is universal. Then only we can say, anecdotally speaking, that what has happened to that particular group over the last 50 years or over the last 200 years. If we relativize time to its specific constituents of the society, then I think that the comparison will become very difficult. So, and that's I will read the last two pages where I elaborate on this theme. But that was that was the key idea I had, where I started thinking that rather than populating the existing study with very new interesting research, but that would just add to saying that, okay, social time is more varied, social time is further plural. Rather than further pluralizing it, I wanted to just change the optic and see what possibilities exist in this realm. Um, to just before that, I read, just want to, so I propose to do that by looking at, there are, I am not offering them as analytical frameworks. It was something which helped me to grapple the absences in the historiography and the potentialities of the source materials. But it is, I am not attaching any prescriptive value to these two terms. One is temporal regime and the other is temporal culture. And in the third chapter, I elaborate what I mean by that. But in nutshell, what it means for me is I see temporal regime as constituted through functioning of institutions, and how people dealt with those institutions. They can also be techniques and technologies. They can be law and authority. So these are something which is a kind of a which creates an structure. So going back to my boatman example, I would say that temporal regime is getting constituted through law and through certain repetitive aspects of seasonality. Uh, Rowing was very difficult in the rainy season. More time was taken, and hence further punishment used to be given to boatmen because there was this aspect of delay. But delay was working through the idea of, so for instance, like the colonial officers who had just arrived in India, they would receive some money to go and join their new posting up in the country, Patna, Banaras, wherever. And depending on the distance, the duration for which they were given this joining money or travel allowance basically was like 4 weeks to Patna, 6 weeks to Banaras, and so on. But that didn't factor in the ecological conditions. Um, so um so that way we can, regime for me is working through what is getting institutionalized through the use of law, or otherwise other, through technology and so on. Temporal culture for me is a more diffused arena of how people, different practices, uh, react or engage with those constituents of regime. For me, if I were to do a history of speed and delay, then I would enter into this world of, okay, what was meant by speed in the late 18th century, and what was meant by speed in the late 19th century, how that changed, and how did people start defining that. But that is in a more diffused manner, which and I would not be just focused on one particular technology or one particular kind of so uh, so once you enter through the study of regime and get into the more larger arena of temporal culture, that is how I'm seeing this But it is more to, for me, it is working more as a handle to make our researches feasible. Uh, how do we make sense of the source materials? Uh, to what limit we expand ourselves and then engage and see um, uh, practices, rhythms, uh, questions of the structures and the diffused uh, its engagement. So these are the key two terms I work with. Uh, and I will just read out the last two pages. Um, I wish to emphasize to think of time as a linear universal entity, purely as a thought aid to help us do social history beyond reinventing the wheel of plurality and multiplicity of time. This does not mean that if time is conceptualized as a linear universal entity, it is naturally laden with ideas of it becoming gradually progressivist or developmentalist. Linearity does not necessarily need to be thought of in terms of a progressive unitary mode of movement of humankind in one direction, akin to the idea of progress. Linearity could simply mean the non reversibility of time. The reversibility of time and recurrence of events do not mean the same thing. That is, events when recurring or appearing to recur do not necessarily mean that time has reversed. A social history of time will be more preoccupied with unearthing minute social practices and contestations over them, through which time became an element of social, ecological, and political relationship. It will pay attention to the mechanisms and the implications of control over time of others by the state, ruling elites, and other dominant groups. It will strive to find time in hidden scripts of the resistance and agency of those who felt dominated. It will look for concrete histories of instruments such as a time measuring device, of inscriptions of power, regularity, and authority inscribed in texts such as the calendar or the almanac, of constellations of technology altering the perception of the passage of time, of law which establishes temporal regimes of control over wider sections of society, of cycles of monsoon, exchange, trade, interest, credit, and debt that create conditions of dearth, prosperity, and planning, and many such concrete instances and entities in and through which time became a factor for forging and perpetuating unequal social relationships. It will explain how historically night was conquered, stigmatized, and romanticized while the day was normalized. It will look at social theorization over time through categories in which time bound sensibilities emerged. The fetish of accuracy, the exercise of power in making someone wait, the enchantment with speed, and, and the disappointment with delay will tell us about society's changing relationship with time. Is there some water here? Water. A social history of time approach, a social history of time starts with this approach starts with the premise that time can be treated as a singular resource, which when it becomes part of social life creates ground for differentiation. In this view, the history of time is not the outcome of the intellectual labor behind the effort to historicize time. Time is not its own object of research. Histories of people and their practices, preferably at the interspecies level in which time is interlaced as a resource of historical action, that is the focus. A social history of time is neither limited to the history of time nor to the history of historicity. More than worrying about time's inherent characteristic, a social history of time approach clearly accentuates practices. It will then seek to unravel the power behind the plurality of practices. While practices may appear autonomous or their nature of interconnections as uneven, which may render time appear plural, the necessity of understanding the mechanism of power requires that the temporal fabric in which they unfold and create synergies and divisions along social groups is taken to be unitary. A singular/universal notion of time is imperative to the prospect of investigating the dynamics of social relationships. If seen in this way, the work of historical intellectual labor will be geared more towards charting the processes through which the temporalization of social relationships occurred in any period, rather than temporalization of time itself. For a long time, it was believed, and it is still so, that modernity had straightened time. Hence, the pre-modern period must appear to us plural. Further, when the Eurocentric basis behind the logic of the straightened time began to be questioned, the global convergence was unpacked to reinsert plurality into time. And so goes the argument. Yes, there was Western hegemony and imposition, but it was neither absolute nor entirely subsuming of other practices. These other practices resisted and forced the unitary European model to adapt itself. Global forces gave birth to local conditions, but the local also forced the global to retreat and reform, and hence we see plurality. The problem is that plurality is not only a resource of the resistant and the marginal, but has also remained a point of justification for the powerful in the past. In other words, power also creates or at least discursively organizes time in plural ways. How are we then to account for such plural temporal past? Colonial history is replete with such examples. Colonialists argued that Indians lived in a different temporal order, shaped by slowness and superstition, which is why the full-fledged Western civility of law or technology was not suitable for them. On what basis can we call their use of pluritemporality fake and ridden with power, and ours as a framework to write about that past as loaded with the possibility of a radical rereading of the past? They argued that natives were a slumbering lot before the whistle of the railways awakened or forced them to value time. We surely cannot take this plural temporal representation, undergirded by political and cultural power of imperialism, at its face value. Colonizers lived in the temporality of acceleration. The colonized were wrapped in the oasis of status. The colonized were consigned to the waiting room of history precisely because the colonizers found time and its plurality to be a significant order of justification. It is evident that colonial plurality were designed to perpetuate hierarchies, whereas the new scholarly plurality is for radical equality. However, the latter also, in a discomforting manner, propagates the idea of discrete, autonomous, and fragmented units or formations of temporality, which potentially relativizes and atomizes time. There is obviously a need to divest time of any ethnocentric values that create orders and hierarchies amongst peoples and cultures in any intrinsic manner. But in order to decouple time from the idea of linear progress, we do not need to relativize time and through its idiomatic use fetishize the past in turn, to the extent that social unevenness of the past begins to take refuge in the plural formation of time. Time must remain in our conceptualization an anchor and a host of change and transformation. The temporal scale of comparison ought to be linear and unitary in order to write the histories of disposition and how time as a social constituent helped in creating that divide. A heavy culturalization and relativization of time is limiting in its scope. Multiple perceptions, plural engagements, and the intermixing of various types and methods of time notation and time experience can still be mapped while assuming time to be non-plural. The framework of plurality might lead us to relativize and atomize time and power to such an extent that the ensuing temporal regimes and cultures will always appear as fractured sovereign entities, incommensurable for historians to firmly locate the interconnected processes of changed continuities and continuous changes. They will appear well secured in their respective domains of the exercise of power without being dominant or hegemonic over each other. What shall the independent itemized plural times be measured to and against? To make power commensurable, accountable, historical, and comparable between individuals, cultures, societies, and practices, time should be treated as non teleological but a non plural entity, while always questioning the location and impulse through which the multiple forms of engagement with it continuously unfold. Given the current planetary and social crises, of which the global warming and global authoritarianism are the two most pressing ones, treating time, at least as a universal placeholder, is not that outrageous an ask. Plurality in time is an outcome of practices and their historicization. Plurality of time can become a significant but empty state. Thank you.
Thank you. That was quite dense, Nitin. Uh, at least I've liked this book. I must confess that this was for me in even though as Nitin mentioned, I have been associated indirectly and from a distance with this project. Uh, Reading this book in certain places, not always, was not easy for me. And that is, I would say, something very positive that you can say about a book. I always, as an undergrad student, I always tell my students, if you understand what you are reading immediately and totally, it means you're reading the wrong thing. Uh, because it means that your world is not being challenged. To that extent, it has been a deeply satisfying um, thing for me to read this book. And I'm still, I must confess, grappling with it. Even though the basic idea, as he put it across here, if you can, for the moment, forget the burden, the load of historiography, if you're familiar with that historiography, it appears, what he's saying appears very commonsensical and simple. We know that there is time in a very specific way. That way, जो जिसको the way we um, relate to time at a commonsensical level. When we say time is singular, when we say time is plural, there is already an understanding of time that we have when we start thinking about it, whether it is singular or plural. But to think of it as a universe, not universe as in the cosmos, but universe, a something that is constituted by a singularity. And within that singularity, various actors, various conditions, various regimes of power um, struggle within social context to do something with it in various ways where temporality chips in. It appears like a simple, useful, interesting way of looking at it. The complexity chips in, as I'm sure all of us were probably able to make out this much. The complexity lies in making this idea work when you're doing history, right? I mean, that is the challenge, and that is the reason why one has to write a book for it. Otherwise, WhatsApp message would have been enough. And I think uh, the challenges of it, the clumsiness of it, the scope, the reward of it is coming through very well in the book, in the way in which the book engages with different kinds of historiography. And I think credit is due to Nitin for having sort of looked at historiographies from very different kinds of temporal settings and researches. And there you can see what is it that is enabled with a certain way of looking at time, and what is it that is disabled because of a certain way of looking at it. So I think we don't have too much of time. This is not a day on which I would fancy that you'd hear my thoughts on it. Uh, I have a couple of questions which I would ideally save for a more appropriate time and open up the house for comments and questions. And then I'll come in, chip in with my question um, at later on. So please feel free to speak, ask, comment, whatever. We have about half an hour. Yes, please.
Not coming from the historiography perspective over here, but from philosophy and politics of it, right? When you say that, when you give the rhetoric that, why do you need to, you cannot resist power with the tools of power. When you say that, they also say that there is multiplicity of time, there is plurality of time. The Britishers also said that there is plurality of time. When you also say that, South also says, or decoloniality, in decoloniality also you say that it is plurality, so you're resisting it. But don't you think when you say that the time as an objective entity out there, and it is our engagement, the people's engagement, that is plural, that is also an argument that led to the singularity of time. One is that, because see, while in history it might be useful, but what happens in politics of it, because of the philosophy of this. So Philip Dan writes about the multiple temporalities of law, since you worked on law and time both. So specifically after you see that the Mandal Kamandal movement that happened, right? When BP Mandal came and the Mandal Commission came. So there were two temporalities that contradicted each other, but had a different view of timelines itself. For example, social justice fervor was like, for the, you know, historical wrongdoings, we would move into for futuristic time where there would be solutions to it. And while the Kamandal was taking us to back, there was a golden period. So the point is, the moment we try to make it singular, don't you think everything's become so static and everything becomes so measured, that leads to the politics ultimately of a very boxed citizenship, very boxed rights, very boxed life? Just a question, not a critique. So I'm still wondering, how do you, and why, I mean, recently in courts, one thing we've realized is that, why are you bringing this PIL? For example, why is that you're talking about it now? Since we as academicians don't face the problem, I can do anything because there is no problem of me doing it. But why bring in a view of time which, separates people from time and say, okay, your engagement is plural, but time is singular? That is what is the reason. That is something that I'm not clear on. And what happens to the politics of time once, if your argument is given ample audience, people start believing in this, if it is taken out of context, and this, like, again. But yeah, that is what my question is. I hope clear.
I think precisely because of the politics of time, to me, it makes sense to think of this constant duality of plurality of actions happening, unfolding, situated within the universal fabric of time. Otherwise, certain communities, castes, for instance, race, if we look at histories of slavery, for instance, if we see a community and write the history of that community from within its logic of time perception, how are we going to make case for social justice then? Precisely for social justice, which requires us to measure and compare who has been left behind and under what historical conditions, due to which historical forces of power and authority, certain communities have been left behind.
This is the problem with singularity of time. You cannot say certain communities are left behind, certain communities are pushed down. So that is the thing. I mean, the metaphor and the rhetoric that you're trying to bring, singularity of time, that there is singular time out there, and we are
I'm not saying it's out there. I'm saying we are embedded in time. It's I think that's why I said that I am not creating an order here. The time is out there as an order A and we act in that as order B. I'm not creating a causal relationship between what comes first. We have to conceptually imagine that both is happening simultaneously. It exists while we make it on our own. But only few people get to make it their own in a better manner than others in a better worse whatever, but there is precisely. I'm very glad that you brought up the question of social justice, because that exactly was in mind, that to make social justice equitable, what would you hold it against and measure it against?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, I think it's amazing. Excepting, I'll reiterate this point that when you said something as, what do they say when they say that the golden age, and what do they say when we have been pushed back? What is the meaning? Is it that they are referring to the past, or are they referring? How are they saying that this is the golden age with reference to what? So in both ways, there is a question. Um, are we going back to sense their, what is their experience? My sense is, and that is something will be important for us. My sense is that when they're talking of the past, they're not actually talking of the past, they're talking of the present. But let's say, it is a contemporaneous experience which is taking on. So here we see clearly the difference between, they are using a universal time, right, in order to talk about plural experience. So it is not that the universal time is some kind of a secular time, let's call it, is something innocent, and it is all contaminated in the same manner as plural time. It is not. What his argument is fetishization, that we fetishize, like decolonial theory fetishizes a particular temporality structures. That fetishization is something, and fetish has a very interesting relation with time, because it exactly erases time in order to make the fetish. So the historicity of anything vanishes when fetish appears. Um, so that's one. Second point which I thought you made, which I think important, and I think you started from there, but I also have to kind of get back to the question that you started with saying, if the oppressors and the oppressed, if the oppressors are also, they speak the same language or language of time, you were critiquing the plural time by saying the oppressors also used, the colonizers also used, yeah, and that itself, the fact that they are speaking the same time itself, you say, is not a valid critique, because it can happen in other situations and all. All right, I agree to that. But that is not the criterion. He's not, at least I understood that he's not saying that just because same language is spoken by or same language of time is spoken by these two, oppressor and oppressed, or colonizer and colonized, that becomes, he's merely saying that the language of the oppressed being on plurality cannot be a validation of the fact that we are different and our thing is different, is a valid, because when you say you are different, someone else has already put you on your difference. Difference has already been structured before you even speak the language, that we are different and we are not going to be sucked into your universal time. Already someone had already pushed you into that situation. So there is a kind of lack of awareness, a kind of simplicity and naivete in the decolonial movement, which says, tumhe pata nahi ki tum already you are speaking the language which had been. I think he was mentioning, he was talking about that. So it's, we can find many examples where the language of the oppressor and oppressor is similar, but that doesn't invalidate the argument where he was going. Just by saying that in some other context it is also similar, doesn't make it invalid as a critique. I merely pointed out. Yet I have a question, and that follows in some ways from what you had said. It has been triggered at partly, I think we have discussed earlier, is the idea of linearity and universality. Does linearity itself, but you seem to move always between linearity and universality. Now, we can imagine something to be linear and not be universal, and something to be universal and not linear. If that is so, you can have a non-linear universal and have a linear universal. Okay, in just taking the question of time. Okay, supposing there is a non-linear universal, then the moving from linearity, question of linearity, you are right. You said that you are not giving any value to linearity per se. That is, that you're not merely equating it with teleology. That means linearity doesn't mean that the end is already known from the beginning. All right, or it is going to be better, or progressivism, or either way, both teleology as well as a kind of continuous development. That is not the point. But how does the question, so is the critique of plurality against the, because you can have a plurality which is universal. So whenever you go to the question of universal and equate it with linearity, I have some problem. I still have a little bit of problem around this question, because universal and unitary, you again have mentioned this universal and unitary notion of time. Universality of time and unitary notion. Maybe there is a point there. Universality, which you kind of said singularity or something. You have also used sometimes the word singularity, but unitary notion, the same notion, okay, as opposed to the universal. Okay, I just wanted your clarification on the question of who is the plural against. Is the plural you are positing against the linear, or against the universal, or against both, or are they in the same level? Or you could have that also, that the plural is posited against the universal as well against the linear, but are they in the same plane, or are they at different planes? That is one point. Other is, do we need the notion of the universal? We need the, because again, you use the word relativizing, so universal versus relativizing. So I think the way your mind or your argument is moving has to come some terms with this problem. Do we necessarily move to the universal when we critique the plural? Do we necessarily move to linear when we critique the plural? So that's it would have been very good from your book itself. You gave a little more of the examples. If you had given, I think many of us students would find it. Now, what is plural time? How it has been, and what a big jump it was to come from plural time to get to the concept of plural time. Say even to point out, we all assume, because we have all studied it. In some ways, we assume it, but it might be useful for you to just give a example both this way, the plural time, and what. How we move to question of plural time first, where was just giving an example even from your research would have validated your some way. No,
I could try. I've forgotten the examples given in the book. No, but on this, and I'm sure we'll return to your thoughts again, because those are important ones. I'm using linearity. Sometimes it feels in the book that I'm using them as interchangeably, but I think what I have in mind in very simple manner, I'm using linearity to indicate irreversibility. Time is irreversible. That is the simple literal meaning I'm using, that it is linear, but it is not teleological. We don't know where it is going, but it is not coming back. That is the simple meaning. Universality or universal, I'm using more as a placeholder comparative tool. Time is moving in a linear fashion. Histories, differentiated histories are happening, are creating plural territories. But I don't want to remain marooned in any of these two territories, but rather put them in a comparative framework to see, to write that history of differentiation, history of power, why, who, and so the question of why and who, basically, who controlled whose time and why, for how long, what's the, so unless we, so I'm using universal as more as a uh, as a hook on which we can pitch, but using it in the concept of time. It is not coming outside of the temporal structure. That's why I'm trying to, I mean, the last third chapter, I speak of grid, actually. So temporal regime and temporal culture create one grid. And then that grid is constituted, again, I understand that it is difficult to uh, materialize our empirical thing into writing, but the grid is simultaneously constituted of concrete actions and events and abstract sense of time. The concrete and the abstract cohabit this grid, which is made up of regime, which is regime and culture. I'm fairly clear is I'm using them as heuristic tool to make sense of how do we go on writing this history, and not leave it at just what Pankaj said, dense level. So to make it, so one of the examples which I can think is, one of the findings of my first book was that the rise in steam engines led to the proliferation of bullock carts, period. Until 1880s, it was not a story of displacement, that new modern uh, technique, which was seen as the, literally, like if you look at the British materials, magazines, and sketches from 1830s and 40s, the steam engine is ascribed with letters called modern time, and it is displacing the horse carriage. No? So there was a huge debate again there. Does what happens to the older mode of travel, older mode of consuming the landscape? Civil Bush's book here I'm referring to. So what would happen? That will become the lost world and so on. In our case, it was most of the arguments ran that the coming of the steam engine would make people punctual. Uh, it will lead to the disappearance of caste. It would lead to the marginalization of pre-existing, pre-modern modes of communication, but that didn't happen. On various facets, it didn't happen. If you look at the first 30 years of history of Indian Railways, maximum time trains are not running on time. This is a history of not punctuality, but of delay. If you look at the history of Indian Railways, like it became a source of great anxiety for the railway companies and the colonial state, that why our trains are not running, why are our trains running late? But if we do that history only through pamphlets which were written by the railway companies for raising funds and whatnot, and for opening up the Indian interior for imperial economic products and so on, we may get swayed that, oh, with the coming of the steam engine, we can start writing the history of punctuality and speed. But there's a co-constitution of its own other at the same time, and that other is not a residue of the past. That the new unpunctuality and the new delay is getting precisely constituted at the time when the new notion of speed is getting constituted. So proliferation of bullock carts is happening because steam engines have come. Because now you need, from railway station to go to your village, more and denser volume of conveyances. So that is what I am. So if we now look at in terms of temporal cultures or temporal analysis, is it two times? Is there a time of a steam engine and time of bullock cart? For me, it is not. For me, they are conjoined. Their history is interdependent, linked, one leading to the other in certain cases, but not always. But asymmetry is there. Yes, it is asymmetrical bind, but there's a bind. So once we keep time as linear and make it a universal placeholder, then we can see, okay, how was railways promoted at the expense of what? Did it happen or not? what were the unintended results of that process, but how did one grid of technology and temporal values associated with that technology changed over a period of time. I'm not saying that railways didn't create effects. Of course, they changed. By the 1920s, with the coming of the motorized cars, things are changing. But things are changing as part of the changing grid in which both the concrete and the abstract, the concrete and that grid keeps shifting. That is my imagination with. I hope that example was. Yes.
Yes. Um, since time has historically been weaponized to perpetuate and weaponize certain narratives of power of politics to spread a particular narrative, do you think time can be used as a means of resistance while historicizing, say, subaltern experiences or the plurality of experiences that we've been talking about?
Well, the first thing which comes to mind was 8 hours work day. That was using mechanical clock to actually question the regime and have a clear distinction between work and leisure. A lot of if you yeah gender has been another very important angle for analyzed for how uh, time is differentiated along gender, but the demand to correct that or to equalize time is based on that idea of sameness, so to say. So a lot of movements historically have used the same structure of sameness, but to demand something else.
Yes.
Understand.
I,
So my question is, you are saying it's a temporal. On one side, you have temporal vision. On the other side, you have temporal culture. So I'm going with this visualization, and I'm asking you, what breaks this temporal grid? And if it doesn't break, what are the shock absorbers within this temporal grid? Like there is power flowing, and because there are different structures of power, the different temporalities which are overflowing, but at the same time, the temporal grid is being maintained because of the temporal culture and the temporal institution. So, what are the shock absorbers? And is there a possibility of breaking this temporal grid? And if so, what is it in your imagination?
in my imagination, as well as in the book, I have argued that the grid moves. The grid is not a fixed structure. The inner constituents of that grid, which constitutes regime and culture, they move. So one example is it can move through new legal interventions, it can move through introduction of new technologies, it can move through actually political crisis and events. So there will be a constant recalibration and mutation of the combination of those constitutions. So over a period of time, 30 years or 40 years, we'll see the new features of that grid. That's how I'm thinking of this. And it can break. A crisis can, and I don't know, ecological crisis, a political crisis, that can actually lead to very sharp realignment of certain factors. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Hitesh. I'm a doctoral researcher at University of Vancouver. I'm an anthropologist. So I find University of Vancouver. Yeah. I find your idea ingenious, pretty interesting. But as a good anthropologist, I will definitely come with a critique of how we are looking at time. So I mean, you try to almost ontologically rob the unit of time. So that's, and then put it at the level of epistemology. So time is practice, time is something that is people use, people constantly repeat. Now, my one and only question is, what is the epistemological merit of it? If we are, because I mean, let's just put it like that. You as a historian, you mentioned that you have your particular commitments. It's not like good or bad, but you are doing this history or using this framework for a particular commitment. I, as an anthropologist, my commitment is, let's say, just to knowledge. So I want to know that what is the, for the lack of the better word, merit of this, epistemological merit of this framework.
I also pursue knowledge.
We also get steel, we also get steel. You know the big ad called Tata Steel. We also, after showing everything, then this will be.
We make champions.
Yeah.
We
I-
question it on
Yeah, I mean, I would slightly put it back in a mischievous way that the discipline of anthropology is not only about pursuit of knowledge, but then the question I'm sure you are asking to yourself of whose knowledge, in whose language, and on whose terms do you refine that knowledge and put it in different baskets of theoretical models, right? And so there's a lot of translation happening in that thing. Like researching on a particular group, society, whatever. But even in that, I mean, so all disciplines do that. The question, like, we all come back to our disciplines language, so to say, and frameworks. A lot of them are shared. A lot of them are certainly specific, depending on methodologies of particular disciplines. But we all do this constant translation work between what we empirically acquire and how we conceptually try to process it. So for me, it's not so much of a disciplinary concern here. And anthropology has a very rich tradition of studying times. But one of the problems which the way I have understood that literature is that while studying time, uh, it became the ground of creating differentiation between modern, pre-modern, traditional and primitive on the one hand, and modern on the other. So it was a very interesting, which Fabian actually wrote on, how this discipline is implicated in the creation of the otherness per se, and using time as a marker of that. So while studying time, this discipline actually used time to create certain new boundaries. And there are many other, like, I see that a lot of uh, frameworks to study colonialism reduces it to the study of moments of encounter. And that also creates certain binaries. So, and binaries per se is not a bad thing, I feel, to get a handle onto what we want to. No, it is good to enter into with a set of binaries, but then we shouldn't remain stuck to that. Our analysis should move forward in dissolving them and seeing what possibilities are there, or in finding that, yeah, these binaries mutated into some other forms of binaries. I mean, so society is full of binaries. Languages do represent the articulations of binaries. So it is not such a bad term for me, as you like to think in binaries, but not remaining stuck is the key for me.
Well, what you were saying, how do you answer that? But about that you were a robber of ontological robber. You robbed time of its being.
Have I?
You're kind of, but he referred continuously to the fact that time has an independent existence beyond human consciousness and all. He wanted to, so he's not robbing it. In fact, he's, I think, endowing it with. Right. He's no, we are nowhere. Mahakal,
Yeah.
we are nothing. We are all creatures of time. But time has an independent existence. So that's what he has said. So, what would you need as an ontological certainty about? So, time, whether time is aware of its own ontology, or a certainty of its own being, we don't know. But we are certain that time has its own. At least that is what I get from his reiteration of the.
Yeah, I wanted to say that. Time in its being exists. I mean, that I'm recognizing. What is its nature? That is not my query.
Exactly. And to me, the question over here is that you take it as some sort of a priority. So it goes into the same sense how, let's say, affect theory has taken affect as some sort of a priority. And the main critique of like a lot of this epiphenomenal framework, I will call it that. A lot of these epiphenomenal framework is that it cannot really situate into the empirical sciences. So that is one of the major concerns that I have as an anthropologist when I try to take any larger framework as pre-existing. And that is why I was asking that what is the epistemological merit of it, since you situated it at the level of epistemology. So
I would say the merit is in in the realm of social history. Not social history per se, but in realm of understanding society in its fullness, in its interconnected forms of unevenness, and its potentiality to create new conditions of change. I think that is where I see the value of this approach, whether it works or not. Change, yeah.
I think if I may just add my bit, I think uh, one connecting thing between the question that you're asking and I guess what he has been trying to explain uh, is probably to realize the link between ontology and epistemology and to understand the historian's assumption, which I guess should be assumption across all scholarship in humanities and social sciences, which is that ontologies become meaningful and operative and significant only epistemologically, right? Otherwise, ontology is just there. So, that is something that anthropologists, historians, all social scientists and humanities scholarship has to admit. I think you had a comment. Yes.
Time may be outside of us. Something is out there. Inside us. What you are, what is my circadian work? But how does it matter, right? In the sense that it may be a phenomena, but how we perceive it at a phenomenal level. So when we say time as being original, universal, and use these categories of time as a fabric, even the original is, I think, space-time fabric comes from our sense. Also, I want to know how do you configure space for speciality or concept of time. So when we do this kind of, it's like putting time to the binary of nature, culture to the nature. And talking about gender again, we know that back in 90s, how sex and gender binary was argued as both being cultural by Butler and others. So it seems like it is, in other sense, a fetishization of time as natural.
That I am fetishizing time as a natural entity. Interesting. I will leave you with that thought. I seriously, yeah. I mean, maybe you will one day read the book and see. Perhaps I'm not doing that. But I can see where that doubt is coming from, because you are thinking that I am putting the time out there as an entity which has its given character, which exists outside of our action. But I cannot emphasize enough that uh, it exists at the same time when we make it our own. That constant traffic, I might be, maybe I will admit that I need a better articulation of this process. But as of now, I'm constantly saying that it is not that it is exists there, we enter into this and come out of that. It exists and we make it our own. It slips back. It is it's a loop, but it's a loop not of timelessness. It is a loop of historical change and transformation. But that's how I imagine this problem. But it is a problem. I'm not negating or dismissing your concerns, but I'm not making it. I'm not making it. Every natural time is simultaneously social, right? We study the movement of the sun and the moon and the planets through certain modes of calculation, which gets represented in almanac, calendars, and so on. So these artifacts are social artifacts. Different cultures have different systems of measurement. So these are social. But to say that time is only socially produced is where I start. Was the time for me to keep thinking about this? That, and there are a lot of historical accounts, anthropological accounts, which says that time is inherently socially produced. To the extent that beyond that process of social production, we cannot know what it is. my claim is also not to know what time is. I leave it on the physicists and philosophers. I see myself not so well equipped intellectually to say what time is. But I have to find a way in which I can write history of how people control time, contest time, adapt to certain rhythms, change certain rhythms. I have to find a way to write that history where time becomes part of social relationship. Yeah. From I cannot read it from here.
You can't read.
No.
Thank you for your RR. Thank you for your insight on Bihar.
Okay.
Particularly your analysis of nested networks. In your work, you show how labor, mobility, and circulation were historically interconnected. In light of your critique of plural time, what happened? To the experience of migrant laborers in Patna, shaped by caste and uneven health access, reflect multiple temporalities or historically produced hierarchy of time within this network.
The second one.
बोल देना, क्या है?
I think that they are historically produced hierarchies. Yeah.
Within this network.
Yeah.
The networks are fine. Raviran Kumar, Institute of Economic Growth. Yeah.
Right.
But there was another question before that, I think. Hi, thank you so much for the wonderful and engaging presentation on time. The topic is of great interest to me as my doctoral research focuses on politics of time and pluralism. I have a question regarding the two phases of time. Two phases of time. You mentioned people live embedded in time.
And people live with time.
People live with time.
This
creates a similar dynamic between structure and agency concerning time. You suggested there is a sense of simultaneity where people living in time are in a way making it their own. Doesn't this idea pose or what is it?
Pose dangers
akin to the self-reflexive and recursive logic of capital? Wow. And how capital encapsulates everything within its logic. Specifically, it seems that when structure and apparatus begin to shape their own what?
desires.
Own desires, people may start to internalize the temporal regime, reflecting it in their own temporal culture. Sorry. What is the question?
It may happen.
The question is still. No, finished. Question was there. But are you agreeing to his thing that it is exactly like structure and agency?
I don't think so.
This living with time and in
No, I
time,
don't
it's
think
not
so.
structure. Huh?
I don't think so.
It is. So if it is not, then there is idea that the structure can those
Create its own
and
logic.
It will suck in everything.
Yeah.
So if you don't, then it's just said no.
No, I haven't. I don't think that I'm posing and then comes the process of structuration, trying to connect the structure and agency. I don't think I'm going there, but I see the concern that yes, are certain regimes, if they become so engrossing that our, as you will find a way to question the power of that regime. We will eventually. Yeah.
What is the empirical basis for claiming a singular time? That's important. Because everything inside the grid is constantly shifting, then the question becomes what exactly makes
the grid stable or singular?
Stable or singular. Yeah. If
that I think I have answered.
Differ, experiences, no? If rhythms differ, experiences diverge, practices recalibrate, then the grid starts to look like an empty abstraction. What? Yeah.
I think part of the question I have answered when
Speaking
Suklata asked, right? When is it grid is stable and
is it the same
timeless?
question? Speaking from this point of view of the body, how one could argue that time is embedded in the body rather than the other way around. That is, body is not embedded in time, but time is embedded in body. From the perspective of body is free about time. As we only enter the grid through the material born body, and there is no other vantage point that we have. What about alien that we have? Well, आगे चलना क्या है? So he's asking. So anyway, he's asking this question about the grid. The grid, is it a kind of like a abstract? This is abstraction. This may be concrete is
Concrete and abstract. The creed is it.
yeah, but the grid abstract or the grid is that's what he's saying. No? Is it
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking in a very simple manner rather than in such. No, that is dense for me. 19th century technological grid is of a certain kind of speed determined by the then technologies, right? Now we have a new understanding of speed with the coming of
whatever.
faster tech or whatever but we have new social uh, yesterday I was talking with some colleagues at CSTS, for instance. We were talking what was our expectation of delay in the 1980s and 1970s, right? You are not calling today when you don't answer a message or a call within 2 hours or 3 hours. That creates a different level of different new kind of anxiety, right? So why has that new anxiety? How has that new anxiety emerged? So that's where I see the grid moving. The grid, and that for me is the realm of the temporal culture, where we have new features of expectation, new features of anxieties and desires, but linked to the changes in the regime that we have faster modes of communication, engendering newer sensibilities of time, speed, delay, expectation. So that's how I'm seeing. So every 20 to 30 years, 40 years, we see certain very fundamental shift. So I'm not actually I'm not making things timeless by going to the nature. Things are moving and constantly shifting. But and that is happening in a lot in political discourse also. Coming back to the very first question.
Yeah.
So we don't have much time. Let me just put in the last word here, apart from thanks, which is that I guess one reason why, I mean, some of the questions are kind of going back to the same thing, which is that I think the takeaway, as I understood from the book after reading the book, is not just for the historian or the anthropologist or but also commonsensically to make sense of multiple ways in which people are simultaneously approaching time. We have to imagine a space where this contestation is happening in a way that allows for both contradictions and mutual reinforcements to unfold. And that is precisely the sense in which, I mean, precisely today, for some it might be Amritkal, for others it is Mahakal. There is a grid that is officially being imposed, and there is an attempt to resist that grid. All of it, we may we have the choice of thinking simply and in terms of relativities. Okay, this is one way. You also have a way. Okay, very good. You're most welcome to have your way of thinking, and you are welcome to have your way of thinking, and there are multiple ways. Let's celebrate the multiplicity. That's the great uh, uh, you know illusion that sometimes liberal democracy can slide into. But what is being said here is that if we assume time as a universal placeholder, we understand that these relativities do not exist independent of each other. They are contesting within the realm of a time that is irreversible, finite, and have multiple claims over it. That singularity of space, where the idea of multiple time can play out. I think that story can be told perhaps only when we realize that there is only that much that is there in time. So, and certainly there is no scope. I see here, at least in the book or the way you spoke about it, of any abstraction here in the, in sort of thinking of grids as abstract or given or ontologically stable. है ना? Is that okay?
Yes.
All right. So thank you very much of all of you for being here and for animating this conversation. And I hope that it ends up in all of us going back to the book and reading it afresh thoughtfully. Thank you.